And thanks for that nice introduction. I'm really excited to talk about this today. I wish I could see everybody's faces in a room, but it's nice to see people's names too. Um, my name is Izabel Aguiar. I'm a postdoc at the Santa Fe Institute, and today I'm going to talk about my work that I did with Johan Ugander and a little bit of my work I did with Dane Taylor on the latent cognitive structures of social networks. And I'm happy if anyone has any questions to just interrupt too as we go throughout. A kind of overview of today is that in order to talk about this work that I want to talk about, we'll do a little bit of an introduction into the work that I did with Johan Ugander. We'll take a brief detour into this work on a tensor factorization model of multilayer interdependence that we did with Dane Taylor. And then after this brief detour, we'll go back out to the main thing that I wanted to talk with everyone about today, which is this latent cognitive structures work. I'll spend a chunk of time on future work because there's some exciting paths that I want to go down that I'd be interested to hear everybody's thoughts on. And then we'll have time for questions. So we'll start with this work on the latent cognitive structures of social networks. This was published in Network Science, and I have a bunch of code on this repo up here if you can see it. So unfortunately, we're not in a room, so my usual kind of game doesn't work, but hopefully you can kind of even just look around at people's names or think of a social environment that you exist in, and think about, let's say think about your home department. Think about the people in that department. And then as you're thinking about the people in that department, I want you to think about all of the people that you are friends with in that department. And then the people that you're friends with, think about who they're friends with, even if you're not necessarily friends with them yourself. And then all of the people that you're not friends with, can you make some type of guess about all of the people that they're friends with as well? So now we kind of all have this same type of data structure in our head. So we have them for different environments, which is interesting. But what we have is we have this perceived social network in our minds. And so the motivating question that we're going to think about as I pursue this work is, can we identify people who share heuristics that they rely on when they're perceiving their social networks? So who shares kind of shortcuts that they are taking when they're filling in these perceived networks that we all just did ourselves. So this type of data structure that we all have in our heads right now is actually called a cognitive social structure. They were introduced by David Krackhart in 1987, and they're exactly what we all have right now. So a surveyor goes into a community. Oftentimes it's kind of like a management team at a company, or maybe it's a classroom. And just like in regular social network data collection, they ask people, who are you friends with? But then they also ask, who do you think everybody else is friends with? And they do this not just for one person in the network or in the environment, but they ask it of every single person that they want to survey. So every single person is asked, who are you connected to? And who do you think everybody else is connected to as well? So I mentioned that these have been around since 1987. There's been a bulk of work about how to understand them. We won't talk about these things in detail, but I think the vocabulary is helpful for at least understanding the philosophy with which these have been generally approached. So there's this original work in 1987. There was a great review paper in 2013. And then there's more modern methods too for a more latent space model. And most of these approaches kind of take on the view of looking at these data structures from these three perspectives. So the first perspective is by looking at the slices of the cognitive social structure. So that's comparing each person's perception to one another. So comparing my perceptions to someone else's, or if I'm in a management company, for example, maybe the president's perception to someone else's. Locally aggregated structures are the data structure that we generally think of as like the real social network. So that's taking everybody's reported connections of their friendships as ground truths. So whoever I say is my friend, those are the edges that are kept, and same with everybody else in the network. When we look at locally aggregated structures historically, what we usually do is we compare everybody's reported edges to other people's. So maybe I compare my slice to the locally aggregated structure, and I see which ones I got wrong, which edges I perceived incorrectly. And similarly, consensus structures are an aggregation of everybody's perceived edges, where we keep an edge between two people if, say, 50% of people in the network also perceived it to be existing. So these are kind of like the most popular perceived friendships, or the most agreed upon perceived friendships. So the majority of the work on cognitive social structures has focused on identifying discrepancies between people's perceptions and some true social network. So as I mentioned, it's comparing maybe my slice, my perception, to the consensus structure, and kind of comparing these discrepancies and seeing what conclusions we can draw from them. But we know a lot more about how people perceive their networks than just individual discrepancies. So Freeman in 1992 theorized that people exaggerate the structure present in their experience in order to build a simplified cognitive conception. This work that was actually on cognitive social structures found that people tend to take small world shortcuts when they recall their social networks. And this more experimental work by Brashears in 2013 found that humans rely on compression heuristics to store large networks. So this work says that the networks that we tend to interact in are much larger than what we can actually physically keep in our brains. And so we have to rely on some sort of compression heuristic, some type of like shortcut or rule in order to navigate these really large networks. And so given this theory about how we take these shortcuts, we build these heuristics, now if we think about all of these perceptions that we all have in our brains right now, or if we think of one small environment, all of those perceptions, we can go back to that motivating question and wonder about the shortcuts we're using. So when we're reporting our own friendships, we might not be using any shortcuts. Like, I generally know the people that I'm friends with, even if I'm incorrect. But when I'm wondering about people that my friends are friends with, given that I tend to exaggerate some type of structure in my experience, I might take one characteristic of my friend and use it to understand how she might be connected to another person with another characteristic. And if I do that for everybody in the network, if I take some type of structure that I'm in my experience and I exaggerate it in order to wonder about if those individual connections are happening, I can use this type of process to perceive my network as a kind of generative thing. So this example that I just walked through is actually a good example of what in network science we call a generative process to describe network formation. And particularly the type of generative process that it well describes, and the one that we'll dive a little bit deeper into today, is the stochastic block model. So the stochastic block model, as I think everybody here probably knows, I don't need to explain it, there's lots of different generalizations, there's lots of different specific types of models. For now, just so we're on the same type of vocabulary page, because I'll invoke it a lot later, I just want to walk through kind of the most simplified idea of the stochastic block model so that we can think about it as a tool for studying these perceived networks. So the most basic version of the stochastic block model says, okay, if we have a population of people and three characteristics, say, three different categories or groups that these people belong to, then the stochastic block model, to generate a network using it, we say, okay, what are the different rates at which people of each of these categories tend to interact with one another? So maybe the math people strongly interact with the other math people, but weakly with people who read, and soccer people strongly interact with soccer people, but weakly with math people. Then if we know how each person in the network is categorized according to these, in this case, three different categories, If I wonder if there's an edge between a math person and a soccer person, or if I want to generate an edge between a math person and a soccer person, I can say, okay, what's the rate at which people generally interact when they belong to each of those two groups? And in this case, I'll say that I can draw an edge, I can flip a coin for that edge according to a Poisson process with that given rate. So that's an oversimplified version of the stochastic block model. Because I want to dive into a little bit of the more mathematical specifics, I'll actually talk about the mixed membership degree corrected stochastic block model that Balkar and Newman introduced in 2011. And it says, given an adjacency matrix, which describes all of the ways that the people in a community are connected to one another, and a number of communities K, so this is like 3 different groups of, say, soccer, math, and reading, then the stochastic block model that we'll be talking about assumes that the Aij entry is drawn from a Poisson distribution with a structured mean. So it says that the edge between nodes I and j can be well described by I's membership to K different communities, J's membership to K different communities, and the rate at which those communities tend to interact with one another, which is given by this affinity matrix, G. So this is the stochastic block model for one single network. So if I'm just thinking about, say, my perception of a network, I could maybe say, okay, great, I can take my perception of the network, my slice, and describe it well with a single layer stochastic block model, saying that I'm categorizing people into these different groups, and here's how I'm assuming those groups tend to interact with one another. But remember, we're not in a setting where we just have one person's perception, and we also want to stray away from just focusing on one person's perception. And so what do we do if we then have every single person's perception of everybody in the network? So one approach that I could take is I could say, okay, what if people categorize according to the same characteristics. So those two matrices are held fixed across perceptions. And then I can go through each perception and fit a different affinity matrix to each person's perception. So I can say, okay, what are the rates at which this person assumes those groups interact? What are the rates at which this person assumes these groups interact? But as we saw in that picture, and as we can see here, what do we do if people are using the same type of heuristics, the same type of shortcuts, and assuming the same types of interaction between those groups as other people in the network? In that case, it might seem a little silly to individually fit a different block model to every single perception, especially given that it can be all of the perceptions could be described by just 2 different stochastic block models. So in this case, we're now going to take this detour into this work that we did with Dane Taylor on a tensor factorization model for multi-layer network interdependence. And this is going to help us give a tool for answering our motivating question of how do we identify when people share these same heuristics in their perceptions? So to talk about this, I'll introduce a couple different vocabulary words. So one of them is just a multi-layer network. A multi-layer network says, okay, I can have a network saying how people interact with one another, but what if I want to break up these like interactions or connections in more specific ways? So instead of just saying who's connected to whom, I want to know who are your coworkers, who are your friends, and who do you ask for advice? So if I want to split up these connections into different particular ways that people are connected, I can think about asking these different types of questions, making an affinity matrix that describes each of these different types of connections. And then if I think about stacking all of these different affinity matrices on top of one another, kind of like the pages in a book, then I can describe this multi-layer network, which has all of these different ways people are connected to one another, as an adjacency tensor now. So the multi-layer network that I just described was different types of connections. But in our case, in this cognitive social structures case, we can think about creating a different affinity matrix for every single person's perception of the network. And in this way, we can think about a cognitive social structure as a multi-layer network where each individual's perception is a different layer in that book of our affinity matrices. So then we want to think about a more general stochastic block model for particular multi-layer networks. Kind of similar to that first approach we just talked about with perceptions, we could think that people belong to the same different categories across the same different groups across different layers, and then fit a different affinity matrix to each layer. But in this example particularly, we might see that the people we ask for advice are related to the people we're friends with and the people we're coworkers with. Or more specifically, the generative process of the people we ask for advice from can be well described already by the generative process of our coworkers and our friends. So this question more generally is, what if layers in a multi-layer network are related to or dependent on one another? So to answer this question, we can think about a tensor decomposition called the non-negative Tucker decomposition. So generally, and I'll extend it to our particular example with the vocab that we've been using, but in general, the non-negative Tucker decomposition decomposes a non-negative tensor A into two factor matrices, a third factor matrix Y, and now a core tensor G. So the NNTuck, as kind of what we termed it, for a specific way of estimating the non-negative Tucker decomposition that well aligns with a stochastic block model, we're going to say if we have an adjacency tensor, a number of communities K, so again, this is kind of like our soccer math, and what was the third one? Reading. And now we have a number of layer communities, which we'll talk more in detail about. Then the NNTuck as a multi-layer stochastic block model assumes that there's a structured mean for the aijk entry of an adjacency tensor. So more specifically, if we want to understand an edge between nodes I and j in the kth layer, we can well describe it with I and j's membership to k different communities again, some combination of the core tensor, and the specific kth row of this third adjacency, of this third factor matrix, describes how that layer's affinity matrix can be written in terms of the core tensor. So just like the single layer stochastic block model that we talked about assumed that nodes belong to K communities, so this was our soccer, math, and reading, which were described by these two factor matrices U and V. Now the non-negative Tucker decomposition as a multi-layer stochastic block model describes not just how nodes belong to K different communities, but also how the layers belong to layer-specific communities. And that will be described in that third factor matrix, Y. So given this type of decomposition, we can go back to that question of what if layers are related to or dependent on one another? So if we want to describe how advice is maybe related to friendship and coworkers, then instead of describing each layer separately with a different stochastic block model, especially if one affinity matrix can be written in terms of the other affinity matrices, then the non-negative Tucker decomposition allows us to incorporate this dependence in a lower order non-negative Tucker decomposition, where specifically the third row in this case of the third factor matrix tells us specifically how the third layer's affinity matrix can be written in terms of the first two. So really conveniently, the structure of this type of tensor decomposition allows us to test for layer dependence as well using the likelihood ratio test. So we can set up different types of assumptions on the structure of the non-negative Tucker decomposition, on the structure of how we want to describe how these multi-layer networks were generated, and test for them. So we can assume that there's layer independence, which assumes that none of the layers can be described using any of the generative processes of the others. A layer-dependent non-negative Tucker decomposition assumes that we can write at least a couple layers in terms of the generative processes of the other ones. And layer redundant assumes that every single layer in a multi-layer network was generated from this exact same stochastic block model. I'm just going to lay these out kind of vaguely right now because I'll talk a little bit more in detail about them after we end this detour. But what's really nice about that is then we can statistically test for when there's layer independence or layer dependence or layer redundance in a multi-layer network. So ending this small detour and going back into the kind of examples that we were thinking about, the takeaway so that you can kind of zone back in for the application that I really want to talk about is that the non-negative Tucker decomposition generalizes the stochastic block model to multi-layer networks and gives a good factor model perspective on testing as well as understanding when there's dependence in between the layers of a multi-layer network. Okay, so we're ending that detour and going back into this example where we're thinking about our perceptions. We're thinking about our perceptions, particularly of a social network, and wondering which people's perceptions can be well described by the same rules as other people in their network. So now that we have more vocabulary and if we want to utilize the tool of the non-negative Tucker decomposition, our detour we just took told us that a multi-layer network can be well described using a non-negative Tucker decomposition, which decomposes an adjacency tensor into latent social spaces and a latent layer space. So now if we want to view a cognitive social structure, all of these different pages of our perceptions stacked on top of each other as a multi-layer network, then now each layer of our multi-layer network corresponds to a different person's perception of the network. So that third factor matrix, which identified a latent layer space, now identifies a latent cognitive space. It identifies when there's structure in our cognitions of our network. So similarly, if we want to go back to our example and say, okay, every single person in this network belongs to one of these three categories, and every single person's perceptions can be described by one of these two generative rules for how those people in each of those communities connect with one another. Then now the non-negative Tucker decomposition gives us these social factor matrices, which will group people together with others who they're connected to. And that third factor matrix, the cognitive factor matrix, will group together people with others who perceive the network similarly. So there's actually really good interpretation of these different spaces we're identifying in the non-negative Tucker decomposition in existing social theory. So the first one is the theory of relational schema, which was introduced by Baldwin in 1992. And what relational schema is that the observation that individuals' recollections of social interactions exaggerate systematic structure provides important insight into the cognitive processes that underlie network perceptions. It suggests that individuals rely on schemas to organize and remember their social networks, and that these schemas frame our experience of the social world. It tells us what interactions we pay attention to and the attributes of others that are meaningful in those interactions. There's also theory on what's called social cognition, which was introduced by Judith Howard in 1994, which articulates explicitly how social structures are carried in individuals' mental systems, and the content of the group dimensions on which people are prone to categorize reveals the connections between these cognitive and social structures. So relational schema describe the generalizations or the patterns that we're relying on when we're recalling these connections. And social cognition tells us how these structures are carried in our minds. So this aligns well with kind of the motivating things from social theory about how we even use shortcuts in our perceptions that we introduced at the beginning, these ones over here. But now we can relate this vocabulary to particular parts of a non-negative Tucker decomposition. So given that individuals' recollections of social interactions exaggerate systematic structure and that these schemas frame our experience of the social world, we can think about the cognitive factor matrix as identifying people who are sharing the same relational schema, who are sharing the same exaggerations of the systematic structure that they're recalling. And then in relation to Judith Howard's social cognition, a cognitive social structure gives us access to a data structure that describes exactly how social structures are carried in individuals' mental systems. And so the non-negative Tucker decomposition can tell us how differences in these perceptions can actually be attributed not just to random noise or misperceptions or incorrectness, but actually differences in our mental systems. Okay, so before we go into an example of a real cognitive social structure, I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about these different assumptions that we can model using a non-negative Tucker decomposition, so that we can actually test for it. So a cognitively independent non-negative Tucker decomposition, as I'll talk about it, specifically assumes in the mathematical structure that every single person's perception of the network is distinct from everyone else's. So that means that the rules that I'm using of how people interact with one another are different from everybody else's in my networks. And that means that the kind of like systematic things that I'm exaggerating in my perceptions are distinct from everybody else's. Separately, a cognitively dependent non-negative Tucker decomposition says that some people's perceptions of the network can be well described by other people's. So in this case, we have two people whose perceptions well describe everybody else's perceptions in some linear combination. And then the other extreme of this is a cognitively redundant non-negative Tucker decomposition, where we assume and model if everybody's perceptions are generated according to the exact same stochastic block model, which corresponds to everybody sharing the same relational schema in their perceptions. I won't have time likely to talk much about this assumption, but it is interesting and related to some future work that I'm pursuing, which is modeling social cognitive agreement, which is assuming that everybody's social position also describes their cognitive position. So people who belong to the same social category share the same relational schema as other people. So in this case, the readers share the same relational schema the mathematicians do and the soccer people do. Okay, so this data set's really amazing, and I'm super grateful to Keith Hunter for letting me analyze it. So this data set is collected over 20 students, 20 undergraduate students from all across the country who came to San Francisco for a leadership course. So they came to California for this leadership course, and then at every single week of the 6-week leadership course, they were asked to report on their perceptions of both the advice network and the friendship network. So we have a cognitive social structure for every single week of this course. And we also have two different cognitive social structures. We have one according to perceived advice connections and one of perceived friendship connections. So this is a super rich data set, and even though it's small, as I'll talk about a little bit later, it's actually the richest data set that we have, or at least that I know of cognitive social structures. So for today, we're going to focus on just comparing the social and cognitive spaces that are identified in the first week of the friendship network and in the last week of the friendship network. So skipping some of the details of how we actually fit these parameters, which I'm happy to talk about, we determined that in the first week of this cognitive social structure, it's best modeled and actually statistically also by a non-negative Tucker decomposition with 2 social groups and 3 cognitive groups. So if we want to visualize the social space and the cognitive space that are identified in this first week, we can think about plotting one visualization of the network and coloring each person according to the group that they most strongly belong to. So in my simplification of the stochastic block model, I said that people either belong to math, reading, or soccer. But in reality, in the way we're actually modeling this data, people can belong to part reading, part soccer, and part math. So it's proportional. So in visualizing this, we can see that in this first social group, the nodes that are darker belong more strongly to that first social group, and the lighter ones belong less strongly to that first social group, and similarly with the second. So we see that the first social group largely identifies these people in the upper left, and the second social group largely identifies people in this bottom right. Similarly, we can view these identified cognitive spaces as well. And we see that for the most part, the first and second kind of group people together similarly to the first and second social group. But now we also have a third cognitive group, which groups together these four people in the middle who belong to both of these social groups. So if we want to interpret these social and cognitive groups that are identified, we can consider what metadata we have access to. So one of them is that we know the self-reported gender of every student in the class. And in this case, there were only 2 reported genders. And we see that in the social grouping of these students in the first week, the social grouping largely groups together people who are of the same gender. And similarly, the cognitive groups, other than this third cognitive group together people of the same gender as well. So we see that the first and second groups largely correspond to the first and second genders, whereas this third cognitive group is a little bit more confusing. So if we fast forward now to the last week of this leadership course and the last week of our friendship cognitive social structure, again, statistically, we determined that we can best fit a non-negative Tucker decomposition with 2 social groups and 3 cognitive groups, which is helpful because now we can think about comparing these different identified spaces to the first week. So now in our first and second social groups, we see that no longer are people socially connected to other people according to their gender. And I'm plotting these in the same position as the first week. And similarly, the cognitive spaces that are identified no longer largely correspond to gender either. And actually, of all of the other metadata we have, which is race, roommates, study groups, and like reported undergraduate majors, none of these metadata well categorize how these people are now perceiving their social networks or the relational schemas that people are sharing. So even this observation has a good relationship to Judith Howard's theory of social cognition. So if we think about that first week and the cognitive groups that were identified in the first week of the course, Howard says that gender and race are social systems of differentiation that are especially prone to cognitive categorization. So it makes sense that we see that people are categorizing according to their self-reported genders. And she also says that actually the fact that we saw this in the very first week that these students all met each other makes sense as well. So she says that systems of classification must be relatively simple in order to provide a beginning place for interaction, and that dichotomies as gender help keeps these like beginning interactions simple. So when we're first meeting people, it's actually very helpful cognitively to categorize and create heuristics according to like simple dichotomies. And even the fact that we didn't see this in the last week of the course is well described in her theory of social cognition too. She says that if schemas are to be sustained and reproduced over time, they must be validated by the accumulation of resources that their enactment engenders. Schemas and resources constitute structure only when they imply and sustain each other over time. So while I strongly believe that there are so many qualitative assessments of the success of something like a leadership class, I do think that this adds an interesting quantitative understanding of the health of this environment. So given that in the first week, we saw that people were categorizing themselves both socially and cognitively according to a simple dichotomy, and that this wasn't engendered or sustained or implied on itself throughout the course of the leadership class, indicates that there was an environment that was cultivated that allowed people to stray away from these simple dichotomies, these simple categorizations, and actually interact and have different, more complicated social cognitions. So the takeaways from this work is that the cognitive social structure, which is my new favorite type of data set, is a multi-layer social network that identifies different perceptions. The non-negative Tucker decomposition as a multi-layer stochastic block model well operationalizes the theory of social cognition by identifying people who share relational schema in their perceptions. And if we look at this longitudinal friendship data set from Keith Hunter, we find an adaptation in relational schema over time away from cognitive categorization determined by gender. So in these last few minutes before we have time for questions, I'll talk a little bit about some future work, mostly just to kind of plant seeds in everybody of things that I'm interested in, if you're interested too and want to reach out, or if you know of things that might help me in thinking about this work as well. I'll skim over a couple of these, but the first one is that recent work on the non-negative Tucker decomposition finds that we can better identify these factor matrices by doing something called volume regularizing, and extending that kind of technically to this work is important. This thing that I kind of teased out of social cognitive agreement is really interesting because it's very practical in terms of like wanting to understand a system, is knowing if people's social categories also kind of determine and feed into their cognitive categories. But there's interesting mathematical hurdles for actually testing and estimating this type of non-negative Tucker decomposition. There's been a lot of work historically in network science on how different seeding strategies propagate information differently in a network. In particular, this 2023 paper is great on understanding how information can be spread more fairly if we seed it into different social categories, into different community structure. As I've thought more about cognitive social structures, I've also gotten a little bit obsessed with this idea that we share information according to our perceived networks, not according to some true network. And so it's interesting to ask how information will cascade differently if we seed it with people in different cognitive communities because they're acting according to their own perceptions, not some kind of omniscient view of the network. These next two, I'll actually skip this first one and talk about the second one a little bit more. So, but they're both related because, as I mentioned, this 2019 data set that Keith Hunter really generously let us look at is the richest cognitive social structure data set that I know of. So the largest cognitive social structure data set that I know of and actually haven't even been able to find has something around like 45 individuals in it. And even that's not really big enough for statistical tests to totally make a ton of sense, or for even these kind of heuristics, other than at very beginning interactions, to even need to be put into play. So there's this interesting question of if we want to collect more larger and richer cognitive social structure data, but we can't actually do that because asking all of these questions about every single possible pair of people in a network becomes super burdensome after a certain size of network, then what are the most important questions we could ask to identify just the structure? So could we either understand that there's most important groups or people to ask questions about and only ask those questions? Or can we ask some sort of larger structured aggregated question about these perceptions in order to identify the structure in larger networks? And more broadly, I'm interested in if these like traces of our cognitions exist elsewhere, kind of like in the wild or in different types of data sets without explicitly asking about cognitions. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. My email is on the screen right now, and I'd be happy to talk about any of this in more detail, either later or now. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Isabel. Yeah, it was really a great talk, really interesting. Okay, I'll yeah, like people, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and ask questions, put them in the chat. I can read them to her. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and I have a couple questions, so I'm just gonna shoot those, I guess. Um, I was particularly interested in like the part that I mean, you haven't really like showed us if you, I don't know if you've looked at it or not, but that like social and cognitive space matching of like people, and I was wondering like if you've seen that in that data set that you applied this model, like non-negative Tucker decomposition as well. Like I was wondering if those people who were in this first social group was also like showing that like first cognitive space that seems to be like more aligning, and so or the people who were in that like whose perception more so aligned with that like third cognitive group were the people who were in that group, you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Totally. Totally. No, that's an excellent question and super fun. Um, So yeah, as I mentioned, there's like a bunch of like kind of technical things in the weeds about how we're estimating these and like the kind of complicated parts of the estimation process that arise when we're specifically constraining these spaces to be equal.
Mhm.
But even so, at our best efforts, which I still do trust quite a bit, both in doing kind of like a cross-validation link prediction task for estimating these parameters. So in that case, it is better to model this cognitive social structure with two social groups and three cognitive groups as separate from two and two. And then specifically constraining the spaces to be equivalent. Statistically, we find that the likelihood ratio test that we've set up, and I put it in this slide, but actually for that case and for all of these cases, we're using something called universal inference, which allows for more flexibility in the types of models that we want to test with a likelihood ratio test. And our likelihood ratio test says that statistically also it's better to model these spaces as different in this case. Um, the reason I really like that question is because A, it's like super technically complicated and fun to think about, but also even kind of just looking at these spaces. So I have them on the screen right now. Um, as I mentioned, like the first cognitive group and the second cognitive group, like mostly correspond to the first and second social groups. And it really is, as you mentioned, just this third group where these people are kind of not aligned with their social group anymore. Um, because even just like statistically and mathematically, we like needed to put them in their own group. I think it's really interesting to think about kind of why they might be in their own group. So I think there's plenty of stories we could invent about why these four people aren't well aligned cognitively with their self-reported gender. And I think it's interesting that we can kind of see that statistically as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for the
And
question.
also I was thinking, I mean, if you have that like longitudinal, like overtime data, I'm not sure if you looked at like different weeks in between as well, but like I think like yeah, as you were saying, at the very beginning of like meeting some new people, you probably use very simple heuristics
Yeah,
like gender, like their backgrounds, their race, all sorts of things
totally.
to like make those like first connections. But that over time, then you would like, I don't know, discover like more things about people. So I would like I think in at least in the social space, I would expect some like breakings and groupings and like some changes until
Yes,
groups like kind of like come to a like steady point, maybe, you know?
totally, totally.
That's also
Yeah,
super interesting, just like looking at like over time how these things change. Maybe like in between, like in weeks, like I don't know, 2 to 4, actually they're like if you were to like fit that with this NNTucker like decomposition, maybe you would need like more like I don't know different
for
um
sure.
spaces more so than like three, and then you would need yeah it's
For sure. Yeah. No, so if people are willing to kind of travel to the fourth dimension with me, there's actually like an interesting thing here where, okay, if we think about that we have a three-dimensional tensor for every single week, we can actually think about that as a four-dimensional tensor where now we have an extra dimension for time. So now
Mhm.
we have one three-dimensional tensor for every week. The non-negative Tucker decomposition is kind of agnostic to what dimension tensor we want to model. And so we can absolutely think about kind of plugging in all of these weaks, this four-dimensional adjacency tensor now, and into the non-negative Tucker decomposition, and kind of identifying particular like change points in the time as well when these cognitions are particularly different. So yeah, that's ongoing work for sure.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yes, please unmute yourself, Katika.
Hi.
Hi.
It's my first seminar that I've attended of WiNS, and this is so cool. Thank you. I really
Oh,
enjoyed
thank you.
it. Have you thought about looking at social media networks? Like, I every time I'm on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever, I see people, and I know that they are like their connections are different than mine, but then I always find myself inferring how they ended up retweeting or reposting this, like what were they seeing, and what is their social network like,
Totally. Yeah, no, super interesting. So this is actually something I've wanted to think about in this context is like, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. Like they're so available, right? Like these like retweet networks or the friendship networks for like Facebook and
Yeah.
things like this. And the thing that I love your opinion on is that I can't totally understand how without explicitly asking, I can also find perceptions in these existing data sets. So like you're totally right. I do the same thing too, where like I do it not with social media, but I do it with like when a more senior researcher says like, oh, do you know this person? Or like, have you ever read this paper? And I'm like, what is the network in your head such that like, you know that like you should
Yeah.
be recommending this? And I haven't been able to get over the feeling of necessity of explicitly asking for those perceptions to be reported versus kind of like existing already.
Mhm.
Which is also my hurdle with the social media, right? Is being like, yes, totally. We're like kind of inferring like, how did you like see that? And like, who are you connected to? But as far as I've been able to think about it, we'd still have to explicitly ask those questions.
Right.
And since we're doing that with now large networks, we'd have to figure out kind of more of this, like, what questions do we ask?
Mhm.
Um, kind of kind of thing. But I agree, you're totally right. And I hope my main takeaway from telling people about this stuff is that like I want to not be the only one obsessed with thinking about what other people are thinking about what other people are thinking about, So
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that that's the question because I am so with you. I'm like trying to think about these different navigations all the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Cool.
Thank you for your talk. It was really, really lovely listening to it and also getting a fresh perspective again, because I roll my head around cognitive social structures for quite a bit.
Oh, fun.
And I'm kind of stuck in the middle with one problem, and maybe you had a similar problem when it came to your data analysis. So what I have in my data set is that the perceived networks are sometimes, of course, extremely sparse. And if I try to fit the models, that can be a bit of a problem. And I don't know, I'm not an expert with your method and stuff, but can you maybe describe how it was for you with the data analysis? And
For
how did you overcome, if yes?
And how what?
How did you overcome it if it was a problem?
Totally. Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And also I would love you to email me because I want to meet everyone working on cognitive social structures. It feels like a small community. Um, and I'd love to know more about specifically what you're thinking about. So yeah, no, I didn't have that issue in this case. So I have only looked, I mean, I've looked at multiple different cognitive social structure data sets. So the two that I showed here, also the two from the perceived advice network from this data set, as well as the original Crackhart data set from 1987. And specifically in this non-negative Tucker decomposition is modeling for sparsity. So in this in this generative process for a multi-layer network, there's kind of this assumption that there's going to be lots of zeros. And when we approach those, when we see those zeros and observe those zeros, those are informative to the heuristics we're identifying as well as the social spaces we're identifying. And so both in the modeling as well as in the kind of more like in the mathematical modeling and in the more like philosophical modeling of this, the sparsity is actually like a kind of good part of it. So yeah.
Okay, that means also that with your with the NNTuck model, you can, like, it's not an issue with how the model would fit and so on and so forth, if there are a lot of zeros, because in like, I don't know, if I use, for example, exponential random graphs, or even like the regressions are sometimes a bit interesting.
Oh, interesting. Totally. Yeah, no. So, and actually this is like a kind of like future work thing that I'm a little obsessed with right now is, so zeros are just as informative as ones in this case. They're like equally as informative. What I think is an interesting question that's more related to this thing, is what if some of the zeros are actually question marks, not zeros? And so the people are being like, no, 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 no. But what they mean is like, I don't know. And in that case, zeros shouldn't be as informative as question marks, and question marks should be informative in a different way. And so extending this both where we have structured question marks and how those question marks can inform the actual structure that we want to identify, as well as like estimating these things where the question marks don't contribute as much or contribute differently to like the maximum likelihood that we're working with in our estimation, I think is really important, because I mean, especially right in these larger networks, like maybe in a network of 20 people, I actually do know characteristics. But if I think of like a college or like a university, right, and I'm like, what law professors are connected to one another? Like, I don't know. Like all of those are going to be question marks, and actually my question marks identify something important about me in my own position. So yeah, the zeros are great for me. They're just as informative, but kind of like wondering if those zeros are real keeps me up at night.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, do we have any other question from the audience? Okay, I'll ask something briefly, because I was also thinking, like, when you talk about like independent cognitive spaces and interdependent ones, or also the redundant ones, right? Like, and then I was thinking, okay, for what kind of like groups or situations, like one or the other would fit better? Like for what kind of like social groups we actually, like, everybody has a like clear idea of what's going on, and everybody
Totally.
would like, I don't know, predict the lengths, or like their perception is like as much close to the reality. So, and we end up like having this like redundant kind of like cognitive spaces across people, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have any like guess about like what kind of like different circumstances would lead to one or the other.
No, totally. That's an awesome question. So the way that I think about the layer independence, is that both mathematically speaking, kind of like linear algebraically, as well as like in reality, layer independence can kind of only happen if there's like very distinct roles for everyone, is kind of the way I'm thinking of it. So more in particular, like if we think of a lot of categories while describing people, so not just 3, but now like 10 categories, then it makes sense that there's a lot of variation in how you and I think those categories exist in a way where there's not actual linear dependence. And so that's a situation of the layer independence. The layer redundance, I think, yeah, like the way I think about that is that that happens when things are so either known or constrained that
Mm,
there's only one way of thinking about it. So there's
yeah.
not enough like variation in thought. There's not enough variation in like experience. Either because everybody kind of knows some type of ground truth, or because all of the kind of more stereotypes or systematic experiences that are exaggerated are shared by everybody. And in that case, that's another time we would see the redundance. Yeah. So I mean, this isn't cognitive multi-layer networks, but the only in our kind of detour work, the only time that statistically as well as like link prediction wise, we found that the layer independent non-negative Tucker decomposition was a good description of a multi-layer network was for a data set of malaria genes and how these different like subsequences match up in different locations. So, and biologically, that kind of means that each part of this is like has its own role and like doesn't share redundance with anywhere else in the structure. So biologically, that made a lot of sense. I think that kind of socially, I haven't interacted with a data set or thought of a data set where actually that would well describe something.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, this
thanks.
was so great. Thanks so much for the great talk, and thanks everybody for joining. Haley just shared a link, so we are asking for nominees for next year. So we put the little like Google form in the chat. So if you think of like if you wanna like be a speaker in the seminar series, just yeah, fill that out. Or if you can think of like anybody else, if you want to share it with people that you think might be a good fit for this seminar, please yeah, share it, and also feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks so much, Izabel, again. And thank you everyone for like yeah, following this seminar series throughout the quarter or the semester or year, I guess. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you all next year. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.